Good morning, and thank you for joining me again for 5 Good Minutes in the Word. I'm Barry Bryson, and today we're going to be introducing the book of 2 Timothy. Yesterday, we spent some time talking about Paul's special relationship with Timothy, his true son in the faith, and so we won't rehash all that tomorrow, but I do want to say that 1st and 2nd Timothy are just wonderful reads. I've been reading them just about every week for more than 30 years. Because this is a letter, as was Titus, we talked about a few days ago. These letters are to young men who are local ministers, about being local ministers. And I'll talk more about that tomorrow, that aspect of the Timothy correspondence, when we talk about 2 Timothy. But today, I want us to think about the book of Timothy in terms of it being a book, a fatherly book from an older man who is single, who is a Christian, to a younger man who is single and a Christian in the local congregation, because Timothy now is a local minister. He's in Ephesus, verse 3, and he's serving that congregation. When we introduced the book of Ephesians, we talked about the fact we know this congregation more than we know any other in the New Testament, and we know from this letter especially that it was at this time kind of a difficult congregation to work in. Not because folks were inactive, but because they were, and they weren't focused. Everybody was wanting to talk about all kinds of things that had nothing to do with their eternal salvation. And Paul needs Timothy to focus and needs this church to focus. Well, in both 1st and 2nd Timothy, the Apostle Paul is worried about Timothy. And in both letters, he's worried about Timothy being assertive, asserting himself, asserting his goodness, asserting his gifts, which are necessary in the congregation. The first thing that he says to Timothy, as a young man, single man, young minister at the church at Ephesus, is to stay focused. And he says this over and over again. Chapter 1, verse 3, as I urged you upon my departure for Macedonia, remain at Ephesus in order that you may instruct certain men not to teach strange doctrines, nor pay attention to myths and endless genealogies which give rise to mere speculation rather than God's provision, which is by faith. But the goal of our instruction is love from a pure heart, a good conscience, and a faith that is without hypocrisy, a sincere faith. Paul says these guys are running down rabbit holes about things that don't really matter. Don't let them do that, and don't you do that either. In fact, he ends 1 Timothy with these words, O Timothy, guard what has been entrusted to you. Avoid worldly and empty chatter and the opposing arguments of what is falsely called knowledge. You stay focused. He also tells Timothy to be assertive, to assert his goodness, to assert the gifts that he has been given. He says in chapter 4, verse 12, don't let anyone look down on your youthfulness, but rather in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity, show yourself an example of those who believe. He goes on to say in verse 15, take pains with all these things, be absorbed in them, that your progress may be evident to all. Pay close attention to yourself and to your teaching. Persevere in these things, for as you do this, you will ensure salvation, both for yourself and for those who hear you. You have a responsibility to use your gifts, to assert your goodness, to take your place in the local congregation, because they need you and what you have to offer. He also tells Timothy, maintain appropriate relationships with everybody. Chapter 5, verse 1, do not sharply rebuke an older man, but rather appeal to him as a father. Treat the younger men like brothers. Treat the older women like mothers, and the younger women like sisters, in all purity. That's what he needs Timothy to do, to maintain appropriate relationships, to stay focused on what's essential, which is love from a sincere faith, and to assert the gifts that he's been given, because the local congregation needs those gifts. 1 Timothy has so much more about grace, and Paul's remembering his own need for grace. There's a long section in chapter 3 about the appointing of elders and deacons. We'll talk a little bit more about that tomorrow. There's a long chapter about the money and the appropriate use of our material wealth. in the kingdom of God in chapter 6. I hope you'll read this book. Although it is written to a young man who is a minister and a young man who is single, Paul's instructions to Timothy apply to us all. They will nourish us all and feed us all as we read 1 Timothy, which I hope you'll do today. Tomorrow, we'll talk about 2 Timothy. Thank you for joining me again for 5 Good Minutes.